Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, we're really excited to be here. Thanks so much, everybody, for making it to the last session of the day. I know it's a long time to be on Zoom, so Laurel and I both really appreciate that you have taken the time to chat with us about language access in your programs. So I will both just introduce ourselves, and then we have a quick little poll quiz for you. But my name is Kirsten Hobie. I use she, her, aya pronouns. As Amelia said, I work at the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network in Colorado. It is just starting to storm here where I am in Boulder, Colorado. So hopefully you don't hear any thunder in the background, but if you hear a loud sound, I'm sorry. I've been at RMIAN for just over a year as the volunteer coordinator, and have been working in volunteer management more generally for about 5 years. I'm also bilingual, Spanish, English, and I manage part of my job at RMIAN is to manage the language access program.
So nice to be here with all of you. As Kirsten said, thanks for hanging out towards the end of your Thursday. My name is Laurel Clefane. I also use she, her, and aya pronouns. Currently, I work as the co-director for the Immigrant Freedom Fund, which is an organization based here in Denver, Colorado, that pays the ICE or immigration bonds for people in ICE custody in Aurora, Colorado, which is just east of Denver. But I also work as a UX designer, and the reason that I'm here with you today is because I used to work as the volunteer coordinator in the role that Kirsten is now filling. And I am a trained Spanish interpreter and translator myself. So I actually started with RMIAN as a volunteer. So this presentation and what we're going to talk to you about is especially near and dear to my heart. And I'm just so grateful that all of you are here and excited to be alongside Kirsten in this virtual presentation. So she's going to kick us off with kind of a warm up to get thinking about languages of language access.
Yeah, so we're going to start off with a 3-question quiz that we won't be grading, but just for fun on language access. So I believe I've just launched the first poll. Our question is, Shuar is an indigenous language with approximately 35,000 speakers throughout the world. What country do most Shuar speakers live in? I'm seeing lots of responses coming in. Your options here are Brazil, Indonesia, or Ecuador. All right, 10 more seconds for anyone else who wants to make a guess. If it makes you feel better, probably everyone here is guessing, so pick whatever you think it might be. All right, I'm going to end the poll here and share the results. So it looks like the majority of you chose Indonesia. The correct answer is actually Ecuador. So this is something that I learned recently when we needed to find a Shuar interpreter. Shuar is an uncommon indigenous language spoken in Ecuador. All right, so next, I'm going to launch the next poll. All right, so the next question is, the Hawaiian language has over 200 words to describe what? Rice, rain, or sunsets? All right. So it looks like the majority of you chose rain. And Laurel, remind me, I think the correct answer is rain. The correct answer is rain. Good job. Sorry, I forgot. And it's not telling me on here. Awesome. Nice job, everybody. Okay, one more question, and then we'll get into some of the meat of this content. The Pope tweets in how many languages? All right, the Pope tweets in how many languages? 3, 9, or 2? Okay, majority has it again. The correct answer is 9. Nice job, everybody. All right, thanks for humoring us and doing the language quiz today. So we're Laurel is gonna just in a moment start chatting about the importance of language access. But just before we get started, I just want to to let you know that we are happy to take questions at any time throughout our presentation. So feel free to share questions in the chat, and we'll be keeping an eye on the chat. And we will also be sharing a variety of resources throughout this presentation. Some of them we'll post in the chat, and some of them we won't, but all of the resources that we are talking about are on CILA's portal for the Pro Bono Symposium. So just wanted to make sure I made sure to mention those things right away, but go ahead and take it away, Laurel.
Awesome. Thanks, Kirsten. And good job with the quizzes, everyone. We were trying to stump you a little bit, but it seems like you foiled us. Okay, so to start off our presentation and contextualize what we're talking about here today, I want to have a little bit of a conversation with you all via the chat of why language access matters in the legal nonprofit setting. So if you have any ideas or any thoughts around this, feel free to pop them in the chat. I would love to see if this is something that you all have already thought about in the context of your organizations or your work. And otherwise, I want to explain why Kirsten and I find it to be important and why language access matters so much, especially in the legal nonprofit setting. So first and foremost, if we are as nonprofits or government service providers to universalize access to our services, we need to ensure that we're not discriminating against any clients or potential clients on the basis of the language that they speak. So in order to truly be public facing and public serving, we need to have systems in place to be able to provide services or intakes to any person, regardless of the language that they speak. We need to be able to communicate with our clients in a way that is effective, in a way that brings us accurate and quality information. That can be difficult if we don't have the assistance of a trained professional like an interpreter or a translator. And kind of a bonus of working with a translator and an interpreter is that they can help you understand the cultural nuances that you might miss if you come from a different cultural background than that of your clients or your potential clients. So I could go on and on about why this matters, but I also want to kind of outline the part at the bottom here. And that is that there is also legal precedent and legal reasoning for why we need to provide these services. The ABA Model Rules of Professional Conduct states that attorneys have an obligation to speak with their clients in their best language in order to provide competent representation. And then there are federal laws that protect people in the limited English proficiency population, which you'll often see referred to as the LEP population. And those federal laws are housed under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. So these things really are baked into law. And I find them to be more essential as part of the offerings of nonprofits than a lot of us have kind of understood them to be in the past. So I think there's a lot of really exciting movement work happening that is incorporating language access. Okay, so as we begin our presentation, I also want to get clear on the language that we're using. So I want to make sure that we're using the same words for the same things, which is important as a translator and interpreter, and just as people speaking the same language wanting to communicate. So Kirsten has pulled up another quiz question. What is the difference between translation and interpretation? So we're curious to see what the results are. This was not something that I knew the answer to before I enrolled in a professional translation and interpretation program. So if this is stumping you a little bit, don't worry. We'll give it maybe another couple of seconds. Kirsten, are there some responses coming in?
Yes, responses are trickling in.
Okay. Awesome.
We're about 50% participation so far. Maybe we'll give it 5 to 10 more seconds and then I'll close it out. All right. Here are the final answers. Do you want to share the correct answer, Laurel?
Yes. So the difference between interpretation and translation is that interpretation refers to the spoken word. So when you're conveying meaning in spoken words, you're interpreting from one language to another. And when you're translating, you are conveying meaning via the written word. So you translate documents, but you interpret speeches. And I just think it's important to be clear about that difference because we'll be referring to both things throughout this presentation. And Kirsten is going to take us into what the program at RMIAN looks like.
Wonderful. Yes. So I've got one more poll for you. And then we'll be done with polls for a while. And this one is just for us to learn a little bit more about where you're coming from. So we don't tell you something you don't already know, or something you do already know. So what does language access look like at your organization? So do you work with translators and interpreter in-house? Do you work with paid translators and interpreters? Are pro bono attorneys responsible for finding their own language support? Some combination of all of those, or we gave an option for other, if there's something that we didn't think of. So if you put other, if you could please share it in the chat so we know what language access looks like at your organization, that would be wonderful. It's like we got lots of different responses coming in, so a good combination of people here. We'll give you another 10, 15 seconds to answer this. All right, I'm going to close it out and just show you all. So it looks like folks have all have very different types of language access at their organization. So thank you so much for participating. So we kind of know where you're coming from. RMIAN is a combination of A through C. So we will start talking about that soon. If you're one of the people that put other, we'd love to see more about that. Feel free to put that in the chat if you'd like, but thank you so much for letting us know. So I just really quick want to touch on just RMIAN's model of representation, because I want to make sure that you understand where we're coming from when we're talking about the language access program. But RMIAN has staff attorneys, and we work with pro bono attorneys for various cases. And we also have a social work program. So we're working, so we have all these different individuals we're working with. All of our in-house attorneys and social workers are bilingual in Spanish and English. So for the most part, our staff members are seeking language support in non-Spanish languages, and our pro bono attorneys are seeking support in all kinds of languages. So that's just sort of the brief overview of what things look like at RMIAN. And just to give you a little bit of a roadmap of the session for today, you can see kind of the agenda here on the screen. But we're going to be spending a bulk of our time today talking about the work that we do with volunteers at RMIAN to help provide language access. And that includes recruitment, training, case assignment, and engagement and appreciation. And then we'll chat a little bit about the paid services that we work with as well, and how we decide when it's best to work with a volunteer or when it's better to hire somebody. So Laurel's going to talk a little bit about volunteer recruitment.
Thank you for that, Kirsten. Yes. So volunteer recruitment, as it seems like some of you are familiar with and others of you maybe are less familiar with, can come in a variety of different forms. First, I want to preface that being bilingual does not automatically make someone a good interpreter or translator. It is an important prerequisite for sure, but interpreting and translating is a trained skill. So it's just important to keep that in mind as you are building a volunteer program, that it's really important to provide training around skills and ethics once you onboard translators and interpreters, especially if they haven't had any background in that before. So some things that were successful when I was doing volunteer recruitment at RMIAN, like I mentioned before, I am a trained translator and interpreter myself, and I graduated from the program at our local community college in Aurora. And it was working with RMIAN was the best real world professional experience that I got after graduation. And I have since worked with a ton of other graduates from that same program who were volunteers with RMIAN as well. So this is a really cool population of people to tap into. They are bilingual, they are trained translators and interpreters, and you have the chance to offer them really high quality professional experience that they can use for their resumes moving forward into the professional realm. So that's like my number one hot tip for finding volunteers. And then we also reached out to international studies programs at local universities and found that that was fruitful as well. A lot of times students are interested in like community service or finding ways to connect with local organizations as part of their coursework. And then I want to mention that local advocacy organizations can be really um, like full resource hubs for you as you try to beef up language access at your organization, especially for languages that might be rarer or for populations that are smaller. I know that, for example, at one point during my tenure at RMIAN, we needed a Pular interpreter, which is the language spoken in Mauritania. And we had a really hard time finding an interpreter, but reached out to a local advocacy organization that supported Mauritanians, and were able to find a Pular interpreter that way. And then finally, word of mouth is really the best way that we've been able to recruit for volunteers. If you provide a really solid volunteer experience, it is likely that your volunteers are going to tell their friends and other people in their network.
So as Laurel mentioned, it's really important to note that translation and interpretation are skills, and being bilingual doesn't necessarily mean that you have those particular skills. However, at RMIAN, we're happy to bring on board anyone who is bilingual as a volunteer and help get them trained up so they feel comfortable to be a translator or interpreter. So on this slide, we'll talk a little bit about what some of that looks like, what some of our orientation and training looks like. So the first step in the process of someone becoming a volunteer is to watch an orientation video. In the orientation video, we give an overview of RMIAN and RMIAN's programs, talk about some of the technical foundations of translating and interpreting, and then also review confidentiality. After that, the prospective volunteer will complete a phone call interview with me. I don't love the word interview because it feels really formal. And I don't want prospective volunteers to feel intimidated by that word. So I just call it a phone call when I'm scheduling it with them. But this is really where we get to know each other, where I'm able to answer some of their questions that they have after watching the video, talk through any concerns they might have about being a translator or interpreter, talk about some of the supports that we provide. And then I'm also learning about this individual and what has motivated them to volunteer, to hopefully help me better support them as time goes forward. Some of our new volunteers want to shadow a current volunteer, particularly for interpretation. So for those who are interested in that, we will set them up with a more experienced current volunteer so that they can sit in on a client meeting. We always make sure we have consent of the attorney and the client as well, before having someone sit in on one of those meetings, just to make sure everyone is comfortable with there being an extra person in the room listening in. But this is a really great way for interpreters to see what this could look like once they are interpreting. We also will try to support volunteers with continuing education as much as possible. Laurel did a really good job during her time at RMIAN of coordinating training, Zoom trainings with volunteers about best practices in translation and interpretation, and bringing in some experts to share. And we have recordings of those videos now, so we share those out with volunteers. And we also have resources available in our volunteer portal, which Laurel is going to flip to so we can show you. On our website, we have this page. It's a password protected page, and we'll share the link to the page and the password with you so you can go in and look if you'd like. But this is where we house all of our resources for translator and interpreter volunteers. So you'll see the orientation video is in there, one of the recorded trainings, instructions for visiting the detention center. We have some glossaries in there. Unfortunately, right now, just for English and Spanish, but hopefully in the future, we'll be able to support other languages as well. That we do have volunteers that we don't only have Spanish speaking volunteers, but we are the majority of our resources are for Spanish speakers. We also have certificates of translation here. some templates, and then also templates for translations themselves. There's a lot of documents. I'm sure you all see this too, a lot of the same types of documents coming through that need to be translated. And this just helps make things go faster for our volunteers when they are able to download a template and just fill in the information. We also have a few redacted translations on here, so volunteers can see some examples of what a high quality translation looks like. We have a few immigration law resources on here, one from CILA, thank you CILA, that we share with our volunteers, as generally the translator and interpreter volunteers don't have any sort of legal or immigration experience. And many of them are very curious and they want to know and they want to understand what they're helping with a little bit better. So we're trying to start sharing more of these sort of immigration law resources with volunteers so that they can learn more as much or as little as they want, they have access to here. And then finally, inclusive and equitable language practices is a very much a value at RMIAN. So we have on our portal here, we have a separate section for information about inclusive language in a variety of languages, and some information about language equity. And then the final resource that we have available to volunteers, Laurel, if you want to flip back to the slide at some point, is me. So I will, since I am bilingual, at least for those who are sending in Spanish translations, I'm able to review the translations that are coming back, particularly those volunteers who are new. I'll review more meticulously and send back edits to volunteers. Or if I see the same thing is happening over and over again with their translations, we'll have a conversation about it. But just reviewing, sending edits, volunteers are typically really excited and they want to hear like, oh, that's a better translation for that word. Awesome. Or they just didn't know how to correctly fill out a certificate of translation. And so they really appreciate that feedback and coaching. For interpreters, it's a little bit harder to provide some coaching just because I'm not at those meetings with them. But they generally, volunteers are good about evaluating themselves and their own abilities. And so they'll come to me if they have questions, or if they no longer feel comfortable on a case because conversations are becoming too technical and they don't know that vocabulary anymore. Volunteers generally will tell me so that I can find someone else to work on that case instead. And also very occasionally I'll get feedback from attorneys too about interpreter volunteers. And then that helps me to be able to talk to the interpreter volunteer and provide some of that feedback and coaching. So here is sort of a flow of what our onboarding process looks like. I touched on some of it with our training, but the very first step in onboarding a new volunteer is that they make contact with RMIAN, usually by emailing me, or we also have an interest form on our website that they can fill out. Then I will email the volunteer with a link to the orientation video, and I just lay out the steps in the email for becoming a volunteer so they know up front what they're getting into. When they finish watching the orientation video, they'll let me know and we'll do that phone call / interview with me. Then we have some paperwork for them to sign. And that includes the confidentiality agreement. We also have a volunteer agreement, which lays out what we expect of volunteers and also what they can expect to get from us. And then we also have to run a background check on all of our volunteers. So we have them fill out the paperwork to complete the background check. The primary reason that we run background checks on volunteers is because it's a requirement from our funders. But even if it weren't a requirement, we would likely be running background checks anyway, because it would, we'd feel more comfortable with sharing the sensitive client information with volunteers once we've gone through those different steps. Unfortunately, it's a little bit different than pro bono attorneys where you already know they've been background checked, you can check their disciplinary history. But with any volunteer from the community, we find that it's helpful to run background checks. And then once that's done, and generally that comes back clean, Then we'll welcome the volunteer to the team and share information about the portal, and also add them to the various listservs so they will receive requests from me. And just one more note on this slide before we move forward. A few of these items, like my list of interview questions, some of these forms, the orientation video, we have links to all of those in CILA's Pro Bono Symposium portal. So definitely, if you're interested in seeing any of those, we tried to share as many different resources with you all as possible. So go ahead and check those out if you're interested. So once a volunteer is part of the team, then we can start assigning them to cases. So like I said, I will put volunteers in various listservs. We use Gmail, and one cool thing about Gmail is that you can make these contact groups. So we have a group for Spanish translators, a group for Spanish interpreters, a group for Portuguese interpreters and translators, etc. So I'll add people to the correct listserv. And then we, whenever I get a request from a staff or a pro bono attorney or social worker, I will email that request out to the appropriate listserv. And the way that I get requests is through a Google form, which Laurel is going to pull up here. So this Google form is available to all staff and pro bono attorneys. We give this to them when we give this to pro bono attorneys when we send out their case summaries. Staff generally have it bookmarked so they can find it easily and fill it out. And Laurel has put the link here in the chat too, if you want to look at it on your own time. But I'm just going to point out a few different things in this request form that really help me as I'm assigning volunteers to cases. So first, we ask for the program and the language required, and the task required, interpretation or translation. So we purposely include the descriptions of what interpretation and translation are, because some people don't know or some people forget. So that is really helpful. The anticipated deadline is really important for translation requests. It can take a little bit of time sometimes to find a volunteer, and then it takes the volunteer time to translate it, especially if it's multiple pages. So I always ask that whenever possible, they give me at least a week to fill requests. And then when there are more urgent requests, then generally I and the volunteers have capacity to fill those, because there aren't always requests where the deadline is tomorrow. But it is very important that they tell me a specific deadline, and not just say as soon as possible. This really helps when a lot of requests are coming in to kind of stay organized and prioritize. Another question on here I'll point out is this one that says remain staff only, which funding source is covering your client. I just want to flag this, that some of the funding sources that we have will help pay for language access. So just a reminder to all of you, or maybe new information for all of you, that there are funding opportunities just for paying for language access. And we do as an organization, we prioritize language access in the budget as well. So for all of the clients that are funded under a grant that doesn't help pay for language access, if we do need to find a paid or professional translator or interpreter, we're able to cover that from the general language budget. Then I also want to talk here about one-time versus ongoing requests for interpretation. So a one-time request would be, I need an interpreter next Monday at 10 a.m. for 2 hours. An ongoing request would be, I would like a Spanish interpreter for the duration of my case. The beauty of working with volunteers is that we can offer both of these options. We can actually pair a volunteer and an attorney to work together to coordinate. This is really efficient just from a staff time perspective. We don't have to be booking meetings all the time, but it's also really wonderful from a client perspective to be able to work with the same person over and over again to develop that trust. It's great for the interpreter to really start to understand the language that both the attorney and the client are using. And I've had attorneys, pro bono attorneys, come back to me and say the interpreter was integral to the case. If it weren't for this person, the client might not have opened up as much, and we might not have gotten that piece of information that we needed. So offering ongoing interpretation is I think one of the best parts about working with volunteers as part of a language access program. I'll also flag the mode of interpretation. We offer telephonic, televideo, or in person. Sometimes, you know, we'll onboard volunteers that live anywhere. They don't have to live in Colorado. For those who do live in Colorado, they just have more opportunities because they can sign up for in-person requests as well. But most attorneys are requesting telephonic or televideo. But I just want to flag, if you're working with detained clients, sometimes there are different restrictions around, like a phone call has to be outgoing instead of incoming, or you have to use this platform for televideo. So just something to be aware of. I know that with CILA, most of you are probably working with children, but just something to flag. And then we also ask a few different pieces of information about the client. Partially, this helps us with our tracking and our budgeting and all of that. It's also helpful for recruiting volunteers for cases. So for example, sharing the client's country of origin helps the volunteer know what kind of language they're getting into. So Mexican Spanish, for example, is very different from Chilean Spanish. So putting the country of origin can be really helpful for volunteers to be able to opt in or opt out based on their own knowledge, language levels, cultural knowledge. We also ask for a brief summary of the case, the question at the bottom of the screen here. This is probably my favorite question on the form, because it's sort of the piece that can pull a volunteer to decide to help with a case. I think all of our volunteers they want to help everybody. But when I'm able to go to a volunteer and say, here's something I know about the case. This client is from this country. They're seeking this form of relief for this reason. It can really help entice volunteers to decide to sign up. And especially for translator volunteers, when often all they're getting is a birth certificate and they don't know a whole lot about what's going on in the case, this is one way for them to feel connected and continue to be connected to the mission. So they decide to continue to support RMIAN as a translator volunteer. So for me, that's a really important part. I'll also flag here special considerations. So we are happy to take any sort of special requests, like if the client would prefer a certain gender of interpreter, or just to flag for a potential interpreter or translator that there's graphic content in the translations, or the case will require discussions of suicidal ideation or sexual abuse. That can help us in recruiting as well. And then finally, we collect documents for translation through the form as well. So attorneys, social workers, whoever can upload their files here for translation. And then those come automatically to me. So I think Laurel is going to flip over to this spreadsheet. So once people fill out requests, they come to me, they come in this spreadsheet and they automatically populate. So here's a request I got yesterday for interpretation, for Somali interpretation. And it's really helpful to stay organized, having the requests come in this way. So I can see them populate. I have this up on my screen all day. And then one kind of beautiful thing about these responses coming through in a spreadsheet is that then we're able to use the spreadsheet for other tracking needs as related to the language program. So the tabs, we have multiple different tabs on the bottom for tracking different parts of the program. So we'll just show you a couple of examples of the emails that I send out to volunteers when I'm seeking help, just so you can see what these requests look like. So these are for interpretation requests. This very top email here is an example of some interpretation requests that I might send out. Always mentioning the first name of the client, where they're from, and what type of relief they're seeking, and then also the time commitment. So in these examples here, the time commitment these are what we would consider ongoing volunteers. If it's just a one-time thing, then I'll just put the exact date and time in there. And generally, I'll also include if it is telephonic, televideo, or in person, so they can decide if that works for them. And then this bottom email is the email that I will send to connect an interpreter with an attorney or a social worker, to get them connected so then they can start scheduling their own calls. I know we have some stuff coming through the chat in the Q&A, so I just want to double check and make sure. Maybe the chat is just Laurel. So I'm seeing a question here. How do you provide training to those who are bilingual but not certified, who come to you interested in volunteering so they have those skills? Yeah, so I would say most, if not all, individuals who come to us are not certified and they are just bilingual. Shouldn't say just bilingual, but they are bilingual and not certified and haven't necessarily gone through a program. So the training that we are providing is partially in the orientation video, where we're providing some of the technical foundations for both translating and interpreting, just some of the basics. And you should be able, if you're interested in seeing more specifically what that looks like, we've included the link to the orientation video, so you're welcome to look at that. And that's the only piece of required training that we give. Then we offer all of a variety of continuing education resources that individuals can look at on their own time. And then that one-on-one coaching is really helpful, particularly with translations. There's a lot of communication generally going back and forth between me and the volunteers about their translations. And generally it's less about the translating themselves, because they can, for the most part, are able to change this document from Spanish into English, for example. But it's more about, like, the formatting should look similar to the original document, and making sure that they understand that and fix anything if needed. Sometimes I get questions about, like, oh, what, that word was spelled wrong. Do I have to mention that in the translation or not? So a lot of it is just sort of this one-on-one support, but we also have all of those resources available on our portal for anyone who wants to do a little bit of extra work. And one other thing I guess I didn't mention is we don't currently offer this, but at one point Laurel was offering study groups for interpreters. And so every other week she would organize or prepare sort of an agenda, and then any volunteer who wanted to could join this Zoom call and practice interpretation together. And then here are just some examples of the emails for translations. So these are out of order, but the bottom corner is the requests. So the who line is about the same as for interpreters, just giving some general information about them, sharing the deadline. And I try to be specific. I don't only give a day, but I give a time as well. I think I've found that if I give just a date, some people interpret that as the morning of that day, and some people interpret it as the evening. And sometimes that is really, the timing is really critical. So I generally give a deadline of noon so that I have it by noon and I can get it to then the attorney or the social worker by 5 p.m. And then on the top here is our example of an email that we'll send to a volunteer once they've signed up to help with something, just a reminder for them of when the deadline is, and noting just reminders about what they need, and attaching the document to be translated. And then I see there's another question in the chat here. So Laurel, I think I'll answer that before you jump into this. So one question, how long does the onboarding process take? I'm seeing in our organization, we have trouble fulfilling the interpreter requests as soon as possible due to the background check, which can take 1 to 3 weeks with the appointment and the time. Yeah, that's a really good question. So generally we are onboarding people before we have assigned them to a specific case or before we have them in mind. So it can be tough if you really need this language and you don't already have a volunteer. Typically what I'll do in that situation is I will just work with a paid agency if we don't already have a volunteer that speaks that language. So we're onboarding volunteers sort of in anticipation of needing their support. The whole onboarding process depends a lot on how quick and how excited the volunteer is. Usually they are pretty quick and excited. So I would say once they submit their interest form or send me an email, that same day I will send them the orientation video. Usually they watch it within 24 hours. And then I'm scheduling a phone call with them maybe a day or two after that. Usually after the phone call, they fill out the paperwork right away. And then our background check usually takes less than a week to come back. And there are so many different background check services that offer different things and that require different things. And I would love to talk about that with someone offline. So feel free to shoot me an email after this if you want to talk more in detail about background checks. But our service at least takes about a week or a little bit less. So probably the whole onboarding process is maybe a week and a half or so to get a new volunteer on. All right. Now I will pass it back to Laurel to chat a little bit about engagement and appreciation.
Thanks, Kirsten, and thanks for answering those questions. And I think you mentioned this, but to the first question about training, I believe that the video that you give to volunteers for the onboarding and training will be included in the materials that CILA will circulate. So if people are interested in kind of the concrete things that RMIAN is using to train people, that will be there. Yeah, so volunteer engagement and appreciation is super important. Kirsten has been working in volunteer coordination for many years, so this is really her specialty in a lot of ways. So we wanted to highlight a couple opportunities that you can use to engage and appreciate your volunteers. A couple ones that are recognized nationally that you can leverage in your work is National Volunteer Week, which happens every year in April. And then Pro Bono Month, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We often, or at RMIAN, I say we like I still work there, but I no longer work there. I just am a big fan. But at RMIAN, they leverage the Pro Bono Month to celebrate both volunteer interpreters as well as attorneys and like medical volunteers that assist. So that's a really good opportunity. Providing opportunities for your volunteers to mix and mingle in person or virtually to the extent that is possible in the form of happy hours or picnics or whatever it may be can be really valuable, especially in this virtual world in which we're existing. It can, we kind of silo ourselves right into these just email chains. And I think it can be really valuable for volunteers to get the chance to interact with other volunteers. Resource sharing as well, like Kirsten mentioned, there's always opportunities to engage local professionals to give trainings or webinars or in-person sessions. And then individual check-ins can be really cool and really valuable. Kirsten does a good job of this at RMIAN, and just kind of carving out time in the calendar to be able to meet one-on-one with the volunteers. Not only are you going to get a better sense of who they are and what their skills and specialties are, but you're going to get a sense for how your volunteer program can be improved. So it's a really good thing to take that time to connect individually as much as you have capacity for. And then this last piece can't really be overstated. The responsiveness, or being responsive to emails, calls, and texts from volunteers is really essential. As volunteer coordinators, volunteer managers, I think that it's really important that we be accessible to the volunteers that we work with so that they feel supported and they feel like they have the skills and the support to be able to provide the services that are so integral to the work that we do. So yeah, just try and be on top of that as much as possible, because it really does pay dividends and make people feel appreciated just in the day-to-day. And then this is a slide that I want to dive into for a moment as well, to discuss when to choose to use a volunteer interpreter or to request the help of a volunteer interpreter or translator versus using a paid language service. So this is really a case-by-case basis, and you'll understand based on the populations that you serve what is going to be best. But the rule of thumb that we tend to use is, okay, if the language that we need services for is supported by a volunteer, that's a great first stop, right? We know we have people that we trust that can help us with that. If we are looking for ongoing interpretation, like Kirsten mentioned earlier, and someone who's going to be able to connect with the attorney directly, using the help of a volunteer for that can be good, so that you can just connect those two people and you don't have to be the intermediary for the duration of the case. It is worth mentioning that volunteers require typically more oversight and coaching, right? Especially if they're more junior translators and interpreters, they can require some more support and time and energy in that way, but it's well worth it. And then on the paid language services side, this should be, or could be, depending on what your budget looks like, supplemental. If there are languages that you need help with that are not supported by the volunteer team, it's important, like we mentioned at the top, to be able to prioritize giving those services, even if it costs the organization money. I can't stress that enough. It's important that we find the services, the language services that we need to be able to provide services to our clients. And then more technical conversations, I always recommend using the help of paid interpreters and translators. So oftentimes for cases like asylum cases, we'll need medical forensic evaluations done. Sometimes clients will need mental health evaluations done. Those are things that are going to be included in the record and submitted to the judge. So it's really important that all the nuances and all the details are captured, which is why it's good to use the services of a highly trained translator or interpreter. And then this last piece is specific, but I think it's really important. So when I was working at RMIAN, we often struggled to find support for Indigenous languages because they tend to be more rare. And I really had this conflict between trying to build out a robust volunteer program, but recognizing that often Indigenous language speakers belong to communities that have been historically and continue to be marginalized. So it was a decision that we made at RMIAN that we would not seek out volunteer Indigenous language speakers, and we would always pay for Indigenous language services to really practice what we're preaching as a social justice organization, right? We want to make sure that we are empowering the communities that we're serving by way of our work. So I just want to kind of put that piece of information in there, and that may apply to different populations that you work with in different ways, but I think it's an important frame to operate from when you're thinking about how to provide these services to your clients. And then it can be hard to find reliable, high quality paid services that you really trust. So we wanted to include some that we really appreciate. Spring Institute is local here in Denver. They are wonderful. Respond Crisis Translations operates nationwide. They're really aware of the immigrant and refugee situation and system that people have to go through in the US. So they, I think, are really good for providing culturally informed services. Heartland Alliance is great because it's on demand. So if you're in a pinch, that can be a really valuable service. Tarjimly is a cool language app that I recommend for people to use even in their daily lives. Like if I know that clients are struggling to interact at the post office or at the grocery store, Tarjimly is a free app that people can download, and it connects you with real-time interpreters from all over the world to help you communicate. Lingua Pros and CILA are Indigenous language. I believe Lingua Pros offers many languages, but I know that Kirsten has relied on them in the past to provide Indigenous language services as well. And CILA is an awesome organization based in Southern California that does the same. And then finally, individual contractors. Always kind of reach out to your local interpreter association if you're needing help finding a rarer language. there are always interpreters and translators that you can find that work freelance. So that's a good kind of final option if you aren't able to find anyone through an agency that you trust. I always forget that that's the last slide. That's the last slide. We do have a few more minutes for any questions. I know while I was speaking, some things came in the chat, and it looks like Kirsten responded to that. But yeah, we're so grateful for your time, and this is something that Kirsten and I are both really excited about, and we can talk about it for much longer than 50 minutes if we wanted to. So please feel free to reach out with any other questions, even if they come up after this presentation. And best of luck to you all in establishing systems that work for your organization. It can be a lot of work, but it really is so important, and it's going to make the services that you do provide that much more valuable to your clients.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Laurel and Kristen. I'll see. I don't want to interrupt any questions, but it seems like there's not any. But thank you both so much. That was a very informative and helpful presentation. A lot of wonderful information there. So we really appreciate you spending the time and sharing your expertise with everyone. Thank you so much.